You're not awake because something is wrong with you. You're awake because your mind won't stop checking, replaying, and preparing, even though nothing needs to be handled right now. Not permission from you. Permission from the part of your system that keeps scanning, just in case. There's something subtle that's been running underneath tonight, and once it shifts, the thinking won't need to finish. Right now, thoughts aren't arriving one by one. They're overlapping. Starting, stopping, restarting, without resolution. That doesn't mean anything is wrong. It means the cognitive brake is still hovering instead of landing. The body notices this before you do. A faint holding behind the eyes. A tight, alert quality in the chest that doesn't fully release. Breath keeps moving, but it isn't being trusted yet. Nothing needs to be corrected. Nothing needs to be understood. This isn't about calming thoughts. It's about letting the system stop finishing them. As awareness stays here, the nervous system begins doing something quiet on its own. Signals that were scanning outward start losing urgency, not disappearing, just thinning. The inhale arrives without effort. The exhale takes slightly longer to leave. With that lengthening, pressure regulation adjusts in the background. Thoughts may still appear, but they don't land with the same weight as less than #0. 5 hashes greater than. They don't demand completion. They don't ask to be followed. There's a moment, often missed, where the mind pauses between one idea and the next. That space is already here. It just hasn't been noticed yet. The body begins to sense support without checking for it. Contact points feel less defined. Muscle tone eases by fractions, not all at once. Another breath passes, out, slightly slower than before. The vagal response strengthens quietly, without needing attention. Mental replay loses its edge. Sentences start without finishing. Endings no longer matter enough to reach. There's no need to monitor this. Monitoring keeps the loop alive. Instead, the system begins to favor gaps. A brief rise of clarity might happen. That's not a setback. It's the first fractionation, a small lift before the drop settles deeper. Breath moves again. In, unremarkable. Out, longer, less controlled. Baroreceptors adjust, and heart rhythm smooths without announcement. Thought density thins. Not quiet, just sparse. Words appear without forming sentences. The need to solve tonight fades slightly. Not gone, just less convincing. There's a softening in the jaw, a release that wasn't planned. The body is learning it doesn't need to stay ready. Another breath cycle passes. Out. Extended is less than #0. 3 hashes greater than even. With it, carbon dioxide tolerance increases, and urgency drops another degree. Thoughts still come, but they arrive incomplete. They dissolve before meaning attaches. This is where effort usually tries to return, and this is where it isn't needed. The system is already shifting states. Nothing has to push it. Nothing has to hold it there. Awareness becomes less pointed. Edges soften. Internal sound dims. Breath continues. Out. Slower again. The parasympathetic response stabilizes, and cognitive demand fades into background noise. There may be a brief sense of almost thinking. That's normal. It doesn't complete. It doesn't need to. The body remains supported. No checking required. The mind doesn't need to follow what comes next. Something deeper is already lining up beneath this, and this same settling response knows how to return whenever you hear this tone again. The shift that started earlier doesn't reverse. It doesn't need reinforcement. Once the system senses reduced demand, it continues in that direction on its own. Thought no longer arrives as a clear object. It shows up softened, edges missing. Meaning doesn't fully attach. The body recognizes this first. Muscle tone lowers another fraction. Not relaxation, a release of readiness. Breath remains present without tracking is less than #0. 5# is greater than in, quiet, out. Slightly longer again. With that extension, vascular pressure evens out, and internal urgency loses coherence. The mind may attempt to organize what's happening. That attempt doesn't finish. It trails off mid-formation. This is the point where effort usually re-enters. Not tonight. There's nothing here to fix. Nothing here to follow. Awareness widens briefly, then drops below the level of commentary. That brief widening is another fractionation, a gentle lift before settling deeper. The chest feels less alert, not heavy, just unguarded. Signals that once demanded attention now pass without registering fully. Breath moves again, out, steady, unforced. The vagal response strengthens, and sensory gain reduces across the system. Internal sound softens. Thought volume lowers without silence. Words lose sequence. There's no need to notice gaps. The nervous system prefers them automatically. Contact with the surface beneath the body feels less defined. Pressure spreads instead of concentrates. Another inhale passes. Another exhale lengthens. Carbon dioxide tolerance increases again, signaling safety to deeper regulatory layers. Thinking tries to restart. It doesn't gather momentum. Fragments appear, then fade, before direction forms. This is not drowsiness is less than #0. 5# is greater than. It's cognitive suspension, a state where the mind no longer needs to resolve. The body holds itself without adjustment. No scanning, no checking. Support is assumed rather than verified. A subtle rise in clarity may pass through. That rise doesn't last. It isn't meant to. The drop that follows carries the system lower. Breath continues. Out, longer, even. Heart rhythm smooths further, and internal timing slows without reference. Thought density thins again. Fewer words, less structure. The need to understand what comes next dissolves. Understanding requires effort. Effort is no longer available. Awareness feels less pointed, more diffuse. Edges blur at the margins of perception. Another breath cycle passes. Out, extended, settling. The parasympathetic state stabilizes, and cognitive processing drops below threshold. Thoughts may still flicker. They don't connect. They don't stack. There is no requirement to follow them. They complete themselves by fading. The body remains still, not because it's held there, but because movement is unnecessary. Internal monitoring loosens. Attention drifts without direction. Breath continues. Out, slow, consistent. With each cycle, signal to noise ratio lowers further. Language inside the mind becomes less grammatical. Less linear is less than #0. 5# is greater than, more like residue than content. This descent doesn't announce itself. It doesn't reverse. The system already recognizes where it's going and stays there. The body no longer waits for confirmation. It has already shifted its expectations downward. What once felt alert now feels neutral, as if vigilance simply lost its purpose. Thought no longer forms in full sentences. Pieces arrive without sequence. Beginnings without endings. Endings without beginnings. This isn't confusion. It's reduced demand. The nervous system prefers efficiency. When there's nothing to respond to, it conserves by quieting. Breath continues without rhythm tracking. In, barely registered. Out, easing a little longer. With that lengthening, the baroflex settles deeper into baseline. Internal sensation becomes less specific. Not numb, just blended. Boundaries soften between areas of the body. The mind may try to check if this is working. That check doesn't complete. It dissolves before reaching a conclusion. Awareness drifts lower, away from interpretation. What remains is raw sensation without commentary. Another breath cycle passes. Out, steady, unforced. Carbon dioxide levels rise slightly, signaling safety at a cellular level. Thought fragments become shorter, less verbal. More like faint impressions is less than #0. 3# is greater than, that don't ask to be named. The forehead smooths without instruction. Muscles release in uneven patches, not all at once. There is a sense of dropping, not falling, just descending below effort. This is the second fractionation, a mild lift of awareness, followed by a deeper settling. The lift passes quickly. Breath moves again. Out, longer, softer. Heart rhythm synchronizes with respiration, reducing internal variability. Thinking becomes inefficient. Loops can't sustain themselves. They break apart before repeating. The need to orient fades. Direction loses relevance. There's no internal map to follow now. Contact with the body feels generalized. Pressure spreads evenly. No single point asks for attention. Another inhale arrives. Another exhale extends. The parasympathetic state deepens, and sensory input dims another degree. Internal dialogue fragments further. Words arrive without grammar. Meaning doesn't assemble. There's a quiet absence where analysis used to sit. Not silence, just unused space. The body remains supported without checking. That assumption no longer needs review. A brief flicker of alertness may appear. That's expected. It passes without engagement. Breath continues. Out, smooth, consistent. With each cycle, neural firing patterns slow and synchronize as less than #0. 5# is greater than, thought density drops again. Fewer impressions, less texture. The effort to stay aware fades. Awareness doesn't disappear. It loosens. Edges blur between one sensation and the next. Time sequencing loses importance. Another breath passes. Out. Extended. Settling further. The system stabilizes in this lower state. Without correction, there is no task remaining, nothing left to resolve. This lower state sustains itself, without needing to rise again. The system no longer looks for an endpoint. There's no sense of moving toward anything. Activity settles into a steady, unremarkable continuation. Thought appears less as language and more as residue, a trace without direction. The body responds by lowering tone again, not a release, a quiet yielding. Breath remains present without shape. In, faint. Out, slightly longer, effortless. With that length, autonomic balance holds without correction. Internal sensation blends further. Edges between areas dissolve. There's no clear center to locate. The mind no longer checks for meaning. Questions don't finish forming. Answers never arrive because they aren't needed. Awareness drifts beneath interpretation, below labeling. What remains is presence without commentary. Another breath cycle passes. Out. Steady is less than #0. 3 is greater than unforced. Carbon dioxide tolerance remains elevated, maintaining deep physiological safety. Thought fragments shorten again, less recognizable, more like passing static than content. The jaw releases another fraction. Tongue rests without adjustment. There's a subtle sense of sinking, not downward, inward. This is cognitive fog, not confusion. A gentle loss of sharpness. Breath moves again. Out, longer, softer. Heart rhythm steadies further, and internal timing slows without reference. Linear thinking can't sustain itself here. Sequences break apart. Order becomes irrelevant. The need to track what's happening fades. Tracking requires effort. Effort is no longer available. Contact with the body feels diffuse. Pressure spreads evenly. No point stands out. Another inhale arrives. Another exhale extends. Parasympathetic dominance holds steady, quieting cortical activity further. Internal dialogue loses coherence. Words fail to assemble. Meaning doesn't gather. There is a soft blankness, where problem-solving once lived, not empty, unused. The body remains supported without confirmation. That assumption no longer needs review. A brief lift of clarity may surface. That's another fractionation. It passes quickly, and the drop that follows is deeper. Breath continues. Out is less than #0. 3 is greater than smooth. Extended. Neural firing synchronizes at a slower pace. Thought density reduces again. Fewer impressions. Less texture. Awareness no longer tries to stay present. Presence remains without effort. Edges between sensations blur further. Sequence loses relevance. Another breath passes. Out, extended, settling. The system stabilizes in this fog. Without correction, nothing needs to change from here. This state holds itself without moving toward anything else. There is no longer a sense of effort entering or leaving. Effort simply isn't relevant here. The system has settled below that layer. Thought no longer presents itself as thought. It's more like a faint echo that doesn't resolve into language. The body responds by holding itself differently. Not tense, not loose. just held. Breath continues without reference. In, barely present. Out, longer, even. With that rhythm, vascular tone remains steady, and internal signaling stays quiet. Internal sensation blends into a single field. There's no separation to track, no edges to define. The mind no longer checks for continuity. Moments don't line up. They simply appear, then fade. Awareness drifts deeper, past fog, past evaluation. What remains is a low, steady presence. Without identity attached is less than #0. 7 hash is greater than. Another breath cycle passes. Out. Extended. Smooth. Carbon dioxide levels remain elevated enough to sustain deep autonomic calm. Thought fragments become rarer. When they appear, they dissolve before recognition. The face holds no expression. Muscles rest without instruction. There is a deeper drop now. Not sudden, not dramatic. Just a quiet settling beneath awareness. This is deep drift, where monitoring no longer functions, where the system stops keeping track of how deep it is. Breath moves again. Out. Slower. Consistent. Heart rhythm remains even, and sensory thresholds stay low. Linear thought cannot survive here. It has nothing to attach to. Sequence collapses on contact. The sense of "I am doing this" fades. Doing isn't present. Only continuation remains. Contact with the body feels generalized. Pressure is everywhere and nowhere. No single signal stands out. Another inhale arrives. Another exhale extends. Parasympathetic regulation holds firmly, quieting cortical activity further. Language inside the mind becomes unusable. Words fail before forming. Meaning never assembles. There is no concern about this. Concern requires identity. Identity has softened beyond relevance. The body remains supported. That fact no longer registers as information. A brief lift of awareness may pass through as less than #0. 5 hash is greater than. That is the final fractionation. It fades quickly, and the settling that follows is deeper still. Breath continues. Out, long, even. Neural activity slows into stable, repeating patterns. Thought density is minimal now. Only faint impressions remain. The sense of self thins, not disappearing, loosening. Edges between awareness and rest dissolve. There is no need to distinguish them. Another breath passes. Out, extended, settling completely. The system holds this depth, without effort. Continuation is already automatic. Nothing needs to guide it, and nothing interrupts it. There is no longer a clear boundary between noticing and resting. The distinction doesn't register anymore. What once felt like you has thinned into a background presence. Not gone, just no longer defined. The body holds itself in a way that doesn't require awareness. Support is assumed without recognition. Breath continues without pattern recognition. In, faint. Out, long, even. With that consistency, autonomic balance maintains itself without correction. Internal sensation no longer separates into parts. Everything blends into a single, quiet field. No signal stands out enough to follow. Thought rarely appears now. When it does, it dissolves before identity forms around it is less than #0. 7 hash is greater than. There is no need to track depth. Depth is no longer perceived. Only continuation remains. Another breath cycle passes. Out. Extended. Settling. Carbon dioxide tolerance stays elevated, holding the system in physiological safety. The sense of being someone doing something softens further. Doing isn't available here. Awareness drifts without center. There is no focal point to return to, no edge to locate. The face remains expressionless. Muscle tone stays low and even. Breath moves again. Out. Slow. Unforced. Heart rhythm remains steady, and internal timing loses reference. Language inside the mind is unusable now. Words do not assemble. Meaning does not collect. Identity continues to soften, not actively, naturally, without resistance. The body remains held. That fact no longer appears as information. Another inhale arrives. Another exhale extends. Parasympathetic dominance holds, quieting remaining cortical activity. There is no anticipation of what comes next. Anticipation requires time. Time has lost sequence. Only a quiet, unstructured continuation remains. No commentary. No need to notice. Breath continues. Out. Long. Even. Neural patterns stabilize into slow, repeating cycles. Awareness no longer holds shape. It diffuses. It blends as less than #0. 7 hash is greater than. There is nothing to finish. Nothing to maintain. The system rests inside itself. The descent no longer needs language. It continues without reference or awareness. There is no signal announcing a deeper state. Nothing marks a transition. The system simply remains where it has settled. Awareness does not gather itself. It does not pull inward or outward. It stays diffused, without a center to organize around. The sense of being a separate observer continues to thin. Observation no longer stands apart from what is being sensed. Breath continues without recognition. In, barely registered. Out, long, steady. With that steadiness, autonomic regulation sustains itself. Without fluctuation, internal sensation remains fully blended. Nothing separates into parts. Nothing stands out long enough to notice. Thought does not organize here. Fragments do not complete. There is no thread to follow. The body holds no readiness. No impulse waits. Support remains unquestioned. Another breath cycle passes. Out. Extended. Even. Carbon dioxide levels remain stable, maintaining deep physiological quiet. There is no effort to stay present. Presence no longer requires participation. It simply persists. Language does not return. Words do not form internally. Meaning does not assemble. Identity continues to dissolve as less than #0. 5 hash is greater than, without direction. Not disappearing. Losing definition. The body feels neither heavy nor light. Those distinctions are no longer useful. Sensation exists without contrast. Breath moves again. Out, slow, consistent. Heart rhythm remains even, and neural activity stays synchronized at low frequency. There is no internal narration, no story to continue, only a quiet continuation without sequence. Awareness does not check itself. Monitoring has faded completely. Nothing calls it back. Another inhale arrives. Another exhale lengthens. Parasympathetic dominance remains uninterrupted, holding the system in stable rest. Thought does not intrude. If anything arises, it dissolves before recognition. There is no concern about depth. Depth is no longer perceived. Only still continuation remains. The sense of being someone thins further into background presence. Identity no longer anchors experience. Breath continues. Out, extended, steady. The nervous system holds this state without correction. There is no need for direction, no internal movement toward anything. The system rests without orientation. Nothing needs to be carried forward. Continuation holds itself without reference. There is no recognition that anything is deepening, no signal that something has changed. The system remains exactly where it is less than #0. 5 is greater than. Awareness does not collect. It does not narrow or expand. It stays evenly diffused, without preference. Internal sensation remains fully blended. No boundary forms. Nothing separates enough to notice. Breath continues without emphasis. In, barely present. Out, long, even, unchanged. With that rhythm, physiological regulation maintains itself without adjustment. Thought does not organize. There is no structure for it to follow. Fragments fail to become content. The body holds no preparatory tone. No readiness remains. Support is assumed without awareness. Another breath cycle passes. Out, extended, steady. Carbon dioxide levels remain stable, keeping the system in deep autonomic rest. There is no monitoring of this state. Monitoring has already dissolved. Nothing checks for progress. Language does not return. Internal narration remains absent. Meaning does not assemble. The sense of position fades. No internal orientation remains. There is no direction to reference. Breath moves again. Out, slow, unforced. Heart rhythm remains even, and neural firing stays synchronized at low intensity. Nothing asks for attention. Nothing offers itself to be followed. Everything stays blended. Awareness does not return to itself. There is no reflex to gather. Presence continues without shape is less than #0. 7 is greater than. Another inhale arrives. Another exhale lengthens. Parasympathetic dominance remains uninterrupted, holding the system in stable rest. Thought does not appear as thought. If anything arises, it dissolves before recognition. There is no sense of waiting. Waiting requires time. Time no longer sequences itself. Breath continues. Out, extended, even. Physiological quiet maintains itself. Nothing moves. Nothing shifts. The system holds itself exactly as it is. There is no recognition that anything is ending. Nothing signals a close. The system remains exactly where it is. Awareness does not return. It does not gather or thin. It stays evenly diffused, without reference. Internal sensation remains blended. Nothing separates into parts. Nothing stands apart long enough to notice. Breath continues without emphasis. In, barely registered. Out, long, even, unchanged. With that steadiness, autonomic regulation maintains itself. Without intervention, thought does not form. There is no structure for it to take. Absence does not announce itself. The body holds no readiness. No impulse waits in the background. Support remains unquestioned. Another breath cycle passes. Out, extended, steady. Carbon dioxide tolerance remains elevated. Keeping physiological systems quiet and stable is less than #0. 5 is greater than. There is no internal monitoring. No check for position or depth. Nothing calls awareness back. Language does not return. Words do not assemble internally. Meaning does not collect. The sense of orientation is absent. No internal direction remains. There is no center to locate. Breath moves again. Out, slow, unforced. Heart rhythm remains even, and neural activity stays synchronized at low frequency. Nothing offers itself to be followed. Nothing requests attention. Everything stays blended. Awareness does not reform. There is no reflex to gather. Presence continues without shape. Another inhale arrives. Another exhale lengthens. Parasympathetic dominance remains uninterrupted, holding the system in stable rest. Thought does not appear as thought. If anything flickers, it dissolves before recognition. There is no sense of before or after. Sequence has no relevance here. Nothing advances. Breath continues. Out, extended, even. Physiological quiet maintains itself. The system remains. Nothing shifts. Nothing needs to announce itself. There is no recognition of a final phase. Nothing signals completion. The system remains unchanged. Breath continues without emphasis. In, barely there. Out, long, even. The rhythm sustains itself quietly. Without guidance is less than #0. 5 is greater than. Awareness does not orient. There is no direction to return to. No reference remains. Internal sensation arrives without boundary. Everything blends. Nothing separates. The body holds no readiness. No tension waits. Support remains unquestioned. Another breath cycle passes. Out, extended again, steady. Physiological quiet maintains itself, without variation. There is no sequence of moments, no before, no after. Nothing advances, nothing concludes. Thought does not appear. Even absence goes unnoticed. Breath continues. Out, slow, even. Neural activity remains minimal and synchronized. Awareness does not return to itself. There is no gathering, no internal movement. The system stays where it is, fully settled. Nothing signals a need to wake. Nothing signals a need to listen. Continuation holds on its own. Breath passes again. Out, extended, unchanged. Physiological regulation remains automatic. There is no closing, no final awareness. The state sustains itself. No reference remains. No effort is required. Nothing needs to happen.